Now I would like to invite Professor Srivastava.
Thank you, Arvind, and it's a pleasure to be here and to be speaking to all of you, to see old friends in this webinar. Let me begin by saying that I have never seen the scale of this crisis in my lifetime. This is, and of course, not only the scale, but the nature of the crisis which affects us today. I won't go into the health dimensions, the mortalities, the loss of lives, and also the health dimensions of the non-COVID patients today who are also feeling a great deal of distress. But as far as the economy is concerned, it has never experienced, we have never experienced anything of this kind. The loss of jobs the degree of loss of jobs that we are seeing, losses in incomes, is perhaps, people are comparing it to the Great Depression of the late 1920s. I don't know whether in the days to come, this will surpass even the Great Depression. But certainly already we have gone beyond every single recession that I'm aware of in the last few decades. The scale of distress that we see in India is absolutely amazing. The degree of hunger, wage loss, the humanitarian crisis in which we have seen crores of migrant workers, stranded all over the country, eager to get back to their areas of origin, and so on. Now, because of the nature of the crisis is so different. The pandemic and the impact of the crisis is so severe that going on from here, we cannot imagine business as usual. We basically have to rethink the entire precepts of how we will go forward from this day onwards. Of course, the immediate issue is one of relief and revival. On issues of relief, a great deal has been said. We, on behalf of the Indian Society of Labour Economics, had articulated our position and sent it to the government of India and states. And we feel that despite that amount that is being done, which is significant, a great deal more needs to be done by way of relief. I will not go into those issues here. Our memorandum is already available. I'll go more into issues of revival. And I'll break up this very brief, 10 to 15 minute the interval that I have to be able to say something into 4 or 5 discrete sets of points. First of all, let me first delineate, when looking beyond the crisis, let me first talk about the basic principles on which I believe the economy and the society will need to be rebuilt. And let me restate them for your consideration. Number one, I think issues that we have talked about, namely equity, inclusion, and non-discrimination. We have talked about these issues, but we have paid lip service to them in the past. And let me say that we will not be able to deal or overcome the effects of this pandemic unless we internalize all of these in the times to come, from now onwards. Equity, let me repeat this, equity, inclusion, and non-discrimination. Secondly, the second very well-known fact, we know that public health is an externality, that it spreads from group A to group B, individual A to individual B. We need to invest far more in public health, far more in health, and make health accessible to each and every individual, irrespective of his status in society. That is the second lesson that we have learned so far. The third issue is that we no longer can differentiate between workspaces and living spaces. And if there is time, I'll say a little more about this, but essentially, we need to understand that the question of public health can only be handled if we provide good access to public health, both in workspaces and living spaces. And this also means providing good housing, good sanitation, good access to drinking water, and good working conditions. Fourth, in the days to come, we have to think in terms of an architecture of universal social security. We have talked about social security for a long time, and this crisis reminds us that we have not been able to put together an architecture where the most needy can be provided with social security. Now, let me basically also then, in this context, these are the four basic principles along which I think we need to think in the days to come. Secondly, let me also just delineate in this context the structure of the informal sector that we are talking about, the revival of which we are talking about. Basically, at this moment, our estimates show that 82% of our workforce is in the informal sector, but almost 96% of the workforce as of now is informal. In other words, out of the 18% or so people who work in the formal sector, out of them also almost 12% are actually informal workers, people who don't have job security. The major impact of this crisis in the first instance has been felt by informal workers, but it is reverberating throughout the informal economy, on informal sector workers in the urban economy, but also on the rural economy. However, the locus of the crisis is on the urban informal economy. And that is where the question of revival also arises. RBI recently said that the 120 districts which are hotspots at present, if we look at these 120 districts, 80% of credit offtake in these districts. In other words, almost 80% of economic activity is concentrated in these 120 districts. If we look at it in another way, given that about 2/3 of our gross national product, GDP, comes from urban areas, the urban hotspots today account for almost 2/3 of that 65%. So in other words, 50% of the economy is currently under lockdown because it constitutes a hotspot. And in the short run, we can only talk about reviving the economy or beginning to revive the economy in the remaining part. Now, how do we do it? And the basic issue is, what is the role of the informal sector in this? And I want to, in order to be able to give you to talk about this role, I want to talk a little bit about the structure of the economy, give you the analytical structure. Think of the informal sector as doing three things: producing goods, producing services, and providing labor. The formal sector of the economy also does the same things, provides goods, provides services, provides labor. But the formal sector of the economy provides labor only to itself. The informal sector of the economy provides labor to not only to itself, but also to the formal sector of the economy. It provides services to itself, also to the formal sector of the economy. It provides goods for itself and also to the formal sector of the economy. The third important sector is the government sector. Imagine the government sector providing services to both the formal sector of the economy and the informal sector of the economy. Now, imagine a situation where we do not allow the informal sector to produce goods and services, but only allow it to provide limited amounts of labor to the formal sector. And the formal sector economy revives a little bit. If that is the model that we follow, in other words, the model that we follow is that we do not allow the informal sector to do, but I would request everybody to please mute their mics because I get all kinds of these things in between. Sorry, yeah. So if you think of the informal sector providing labor, and the formal sector only utilizing this labor to provide goods and services, then there are two consequences of this. One, the cost of living for workers in the informal sector will rise because they will not be able to avail cheap goods and services which they produce for themselves. Therefore, their real wages will decline. And there will be a temporary redistribution of incomes from workers in the informal sector. Already these incomes, as you know, have been highly compressed and they have gone down. But there will be a further redistribution from them to the formal sector. But in the long run, and even in the medium run, this will not resolve the crisis. Both the supply side and the demand side would be so severely constrained that the economy will not be able to stand up and the economy will not be able to grow at all. So, in order for the economy to sustain growth, it is necessary that activity in the informal sector also be revived. The government of India has taken steps to revive activity in the agricultural sector. However, not enough has been done to revive activity in the informal sector. If you look at the government of India's guidelines, the initial guidelines which related to public health, which to focus precisely on social distancing, addressed a middle class India. Because as we know, the India which lives in congested cities and slums cannot do physical distancing, cannot follow physical distancing in the same way that upper and middle class India can't go. Now, if you look at the government of India's guidelines on revival of the economy, they focus on the organized sector of the economy. The standard operating procedures that have been set out are for the organized sector of the economy. If you look at the SOP for migrant workers, within state migrant workers, they are with the limited perspective of providing labor to the organized sector of the economy to the extent that the organized sector of the economy revives. Now, in essence, this can do what demonetization did, and this can do what GST did. In other words, it can redistribute incomes in a limited way from the informal sector for the formal sector. But the nature of the current crisis is so extreme that it will not allow the economy to stand up on its own legs. Secondly, I do not believe that even from a public health perspective, it is wise not to allow the informal economy to stand on its own legs. If you look at what other countries are doing, for example, if you look at what Germany has done yesterday itself, what it has done is it has allowed mom and pop stores, small stores, to open in a variety of sports, in a variety of industries. The reason for that is that it seems less risky, it puts less pressure. There will be less crowds in dealing with customers at smaller stores. So smaller stores are better in providing decentralized goods and services, and in some sense, they're less of a public health risk than our larger stores and larger distribution networks. So in my view, there is no standard analytical structure which supports that that SOPs should only be set up for larger entities, larger organized sector entities. There is also the issue of supply chains. Like supply chains are deeply embedded, not only in the organized, they are deeply embedded and go all the way from the organized sector of the economy to the informal sector of the economy. All this means that we have to think in a new fashion. We have to think in the days to come how we can revive the informal sector of the economy along with the other sectors of the economy. We have to bring in our expertise to think of what this will do or not do for the incomes which need to be generated in the informal sector of the economy, which employs such a large percentage of people. I think we need to think afresh of these issues. I personally think that the existing paradigm where the government of India is actually encouraging a particular sector to revive and is not particularly thinking of the other sectors of the economy requires to be analyzed, requires, if possible, to be critiqued. Further, the point that I would like to make is that in order to combine the public health aspect with the aspects of economic revival, we need to think in terms of decentralized governance institutions and decentralized functioning. I go back to the point which Dr. Reddy made a little while ago. He talked about the Kerala model. And I think at this point, we need to be very nimble-footed in trying to address issues at the local levels. We cannot survive in a command economy. A command economy is not nimble-footed enough to deal with the challenges in the post-pandemic period. Therefore, we need to go back and think of local governance institutions and local models where we can deal both with economic revival, but also to deal with associated health risks. We are in a situation where we have to think on first principles. We are in a situation which is very uncertain. And therefore, all of us have to reflect on the situation such as we are. The basic principles that need to guide us are the principles that I laid down at the beginning, which is equity, inclusion, and non-discrimination. The same principles that I have talked about it also they need to guide our behavior towards migrant workers. In my view, the migrant workers, who number about 5.5 to 6 crores, and I'm talking here about the migrant workers in the wage economy, have been treated and handled very badly in the wake of the pandemic. About half these migrant workers are interstate migrant workers, and the government of India says that about 1 crore of these workers are in shelters. The government of India's latest notification says that these workers can be classified, and if they wish, they can be employed in sectors of the economy which are currently being revived. Now, I would like to point out that is subject to standard health protocols. I cannot see the reason why these migrant workers cannot be repatriated to their home locations. Of course, if they choose to be part of an economy which is being revived, they will have the choice, and quite certainly their employers or their contractors, whoever they are, will be able to get in touch with them. But subject to that proviso, we are dealing with a crisis, we are dealing with a humanitarian crisis, we are dealing with separation of families, and I think it is the duty and responsibility of governments to make it possible, subject to health protocols, which we are laying down from day to day. We are laying this down for students. We are laying these protocols down for pilgrims. We have now laid them down for stranded migrant workers who will be put to work within particular states. Subject to that, these workers should be repatriated. Their issues of shelter, their issues of cash wage compensation, and their issues of repatriation should be addressed on a priority basis. In the long run, the last point I want to make is that we need to think in terms of a unified labor market. We cannot think permanently in terms of circular migrants servicing a formal economy. We need a unified labor market where the migrant workers and the informal workers and the formal workers can be employed on similar terms, can be given the same dignity, the same access to public health, can be given dignified conditions of housing, dignified conditions of work. Therefore, in future, we have to think of a different regime of work. And the future is not just somewhere out in some years from now. The future means thinking about this from now onwards. So I think the pandemic has given, it's put a lot on our plate. We are in the middle of a crisis. We are reflecting on what to do about the crisis on a day-to-day basis. But I think we need to be guided by different precepts. And I must say that it pains me. And also I feel that a great deal more thought needs to be put in the direction that we are going. Otherwise, society will become more unequal, more exclusionary, and the burden of crisis will fall on too many people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Srivastava, for providing us so many clues that how we can restore work in our informal sector.